Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing The War for Palestine, edited by Eugene, Rogan, and Avi Shlaim. Give you a little closer look up at the cover there. So this is a series of essays, scholarly essays, extensively footnoted. There's 10 essays in the book. There's an afterword by Edward Said, actually. And these take on different aspects of the 1948 war. Now I'm going to be breaking this into two parts so that this review doesn't run too long. So in this first part, I'm going to be doing the same thing I'll do in the second part, which is summarizing in a very short way the arguments of the essayists. And I want to start actually in the introduction because it sets out some myths that we often hear about the war. Simha Flappen set the agenda when he reduced the historiography on the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948 to 7 myths. 1. That the Zionists accepted the UN partition resolution and planned for peace. 2. That the Arabs rejected the partition and launched the war. 3. That the Palestinians fled, voluntarily intending reconquest. 4. That the Arab states had united to expel the Jews from Palestine. 5. That the Arab invasion made war inevitable. 6. That a defenseless Israel faced destruction by the Arab Goliath. And 7. Israel subsequently sought peace, but no Arab leader responded. And the response to this, Benny Morris provided the first documentary evidence to demonstrate Israeli responsibility for the flight of the Palestinians from their homes. Avi Shlaim overturned the myth of the Arab Goliath and documented peace overtures to Israel by King Abdullah of Jordan and even the Syrian leader Husni al-Zaim. Ilan Pape demonstrated that Britain, far from seeking to prevent the creation of a Jewish state as argued by Zionist historiography, sought instead to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. The sociological consequences of the state's myth-making have in turn been scrutinized by Ze'ev Sternhell. These works have provoked enormous controversy within Israel, and their authors have become a self-conscious group referred to as the New Historians. So obviously we've covered some of the new historians on this channel already, but I just wanted to set the stage for what we're going to be talking about because you really have to understand that everything that's happening today, and this video is being recorded in 2024, has to go back at least to 1948 when this war happened. Many Palestinians were expelled from their homes and or fled. Fine, if you want to use the word fled as well, expelled, fled, whatever it might be, and are now permanently outside, semi-permanently outside the state of Israel. And until the 1948 situation is resolved, we are stuck where we are. So that has to be resolved. And so you need to go back to 1948 and find out, well, what is it exactly that happened in 1948? Because honestly, most people don't know. So the very first essay is by Rashid Khalidi. Now, I've already reviewed Professor Khalidi's book, The Iron Cage, of which this short essay is merely a summary. So I'll put a reference, I'll put a card up for the first and second parts of that review. That's, I suppose, the first of those multi-part reviews that I've had to do because there's too much to cover. And I'll just read to you a summary within the essay, which I think will, if you haven't seen my review on The Iron Cage, might get you curious and might understand what the point of Professor Khalidi's preachy, his summary in this particular volume is. Nevertheless, a version of history that starts with the insuperable nature of their foes conveniently absolves the Palestinians of any responsibility for their own fate, since if their enemies were so numerous and powerful, it is little surprise that they were defeated, and no further analysis is required. However, factors such as the poor political calculations and the disorganization, confusion, and leaderless chaos on the Palestinian side, all of which contributed measurably to the debacle, need to be factored into the Palestinian historical narrative. So too does the fact that the Palestinians, still suffering acutely from the after effects of the defeat of the 1936-39 revolt, and deprived of a central parastate mechanism, a unified leadership, and representative institutions, in consequence never had a chance of retaining control of their country, since they were engaged in an all-out military confrontation with the organized forces of the Yishuv. So, as I say, there's plenty more there. go and watch the review that I did, consider reading Professor Khalidi's book, The Iron Cage. The next, revisiting the Palestinian Exodus of 1948. What Benny Morris covers in this book, he covers in both his book called 1948 and The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, reviews of which are coming soon. Those are also long books that I've had to digest and understand. But central to the thesis of the essay in this book is that there was no documented order given by the pre-Israeli government. So obviously this is before 1948, so before the comment section says it wasn't Israel. Okay, Ben Gurion, the Haganah, however you want to call it, the pre-IDF, the pre-Israel government, there wasn't an order given to expel all the Palestinians. But what is clear, and Morris himself documents it over in this essay, and I'm about to read you quotes, is that the idea was in the governmental level for the Zionists, among the officer corps, and among the soldiers. So Benny Morris is trying to say, well, there wasn't an order, therefore it's not fair for you to say that this was planned. But you don't have to have an order for there to be a plan, in the sense that if everyone is thinking the same thing, you don't need to give an order. If everybody is on the same page with an agenda, you don't need to give an order. And so as Layla Parsons asks in the essay which follows this essay, how is it at some point that many little orders add up to being one big order? But we'll get to her essay in a moment. But let me just walk you through some of what Morris is claiming here. The problem with partition, however, was that any way one divided the country, unless one declared the minute area of Tel Aviv and its immediate environs a Jewish state, the state that emerged would necessarily contain an Arab majority, or at least a very large Arab minority, subversive of and hostile to the Jewish polity to which it had been consigned. Indeed, the Jewish state faced such a problem in the UN partition plan of November 1947. It would have had 55% Jews and 40 to 45% Arabs. Any way one cut it, partition would be extremely problematic to say the least. How, for instance, the new state would have dealt with its enormous Arab minority in 1948 had there been no war and no refugee problem is a good question. This is a quote from his diaries. I've read this quote many times. I will continue to read this quote. This is from Theodore Herzl's diaries. He never meant for it to be as public as soon as they were, but he wrote this down in June of 1895. We must expropriate gently. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our country. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. So they knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew they had to keep it quiet or the world would react. And there was a plan among the Zionists from 1895. So whether there was a military order given in 1948 is really not as relevant as Morris would have us believe, as it was clear in Zionist thinking at the highest levels and all the way down, I would say even to some of the lowest levels, that the Arabs, the Palestinians, they had to go. That was the reality of things. Here's another quote along those lines. Who does this come from? Oh, this is from David Ben Gurion's diary. There are a number of things that we struggle for now, but which we cannot achieve. For example, the Negev. And if you don't know the Negev, it's the desert down here. On the other hand, the evacuation of the Arabs from the Jezreel Valley, we must achieve now. And if not, perhaps we will never achieve it. If we do not succeed in removing the Arabs from our midst, when a royal commission proposes this to England, and transferring them to the Arab area, it will not be achievable easily or perhaps at all after the Jewish state is established, and the rights of the minorities in it will necessarily be assured, and the whole world that is antagonistic towards us will carefully scrutinize our behavior towards our minorities. That this thing must be done now. He's talking about transfer. And the first step, perhaps the crucial step, is conditioning ourselves for its implementation. The idea was that the Peel Commission, in its report, had suggested the possibility of transfer. So they said, well, if England is suggesting it, then we don't have to look like the bad guys. We can just say, well, we're going along with what the Peel Commission suggested, which was a great strategic move. Once again, one of the many brilliant strategic moves we would see from Ben-Gurion and his leadership. On 12 June, the matter was roundly discussed. Werner David Senator, a Hebrew University executive, said that the yeshuv must aim for maximal transfer. Menachem Ushishkin, head of the JNF, Jewish National Fund, said that there was nothing immoral about transferring 60,000 Arab families. It is the most moral thing to do, Burl Katz-Nelson, one of the dominant Mapai party leaders, said. A large transfer must be agreed. And Ben-Gurion said, I support compulsory transfer. I don't see in it anything immoral. Well, of course you wouldn't see anything immoral in it because it doesn't affect you. Eliyahu Dobkin, a Mapai stalwart and director of the Jewish Agency's Immigration Department, said, there will be in the country a large Arab minority and it must be ejected. There is no room for our internal inhibitions in this matter. So you can see they even had moral problems in their own midst, and they had to say, no, we have to crush those moral inhibitions. Even in our midst, we have to think that it's okay. And Morris asks, what is the importance of these expressions of support for transfer in the decade before 1948? How do they connect to what actually happened during the first Arab-Israeli war? Some researchers, such as Masala, will have us believe that there was a direct causal one-to-one link between the earlier thinking and the subsequent actions. My feeling is that the connection is more subtle and indirect. I don't know why Morris thinks that this makes him so much better, but the result is the same. Whether there was a direct causal one-to-one link between Zionists thinking about transfer and the implementation of transfer in 1948, or whether, as Morris says, it's more subtle, it's indirect, it doesn't matter. The result is the same: an unjust expulsion and refusal of the right to return of refugees. So I don't know why Morris thinks that this is such an important point that he's making. He's simply making a distinction that really doesn't make much of a difference. And here's something else. Let me add that with respect to both expulsions and atrocities, we can expect additional revelations as the years pass and as more Israeli records become available. As things stand, the IDFA has a standing policy guideline not to open material explicitly describing expulsions and atrocities. Thus, much IDF material on these subjects remains closed. What a surprise! Now, keep in mind, the first edition of this book comes out in 2001, another in 2007, so perhaps certainly some more archives have been revealed, but it's very revelatory to hear that the IDFA has a standing policy not to open material explicitly describing expulsions and atrocities. I thought that Israel was a democracy. I thought Israel was where the people ruled. I thought it wasn't a dictatorship. Why is it that material which describes expulsions and atrocities, possibly war crimes, is not something that Israel is willing to stand and show to people, not even to their own people? I think that's a question that might be asked. So there is a general order that is given from a general some days after some of the expulsions, and I think during a truce period. And Morris cites this order as problematic for a number of reasons, and I agree with his assertion that if these things weren't happening, why give this general order? If these things were not supposed to happen, why give this general order? So I'll just read it, and we'll see if we can have some clarity after I finish reading it. After 2 trips around the newly conquered areas of the Galilee by Ezra Danin, Zvi Meckler of the political department of the ministry, Shmuel Yadi of the Syrian and Lebanese section in my department, and myself, we heard from all the commanders with whom we had contact that during the operations in the Galilee and in Lebanon, they had no clear orders, no clear line concerning behavior towards the Arabs in the conquered areas. Expulsion of the inhabitants or leaving them in place, harsh or soft behavior, discrimination in favor of Christians or not, special treatment of Maronites, special treatment of Matawalis, etc., etc. As for those acts of cruelty perpetrated by the IDF, certainly some of them were carried out for reasons not connected to those considerations, but I have no doubt that some of them would not have happened had the conquering army had a clear policy regarding behavior towards civilian populations. So, again, Morris fails to understand that part of a strategy is not to have a clear policy. If you have something in writing, then someone can point back later historically and say, see, they had it in writing, this was an expulsion. But if you don't have anything in writing, you can just let the soldiers conduct themselves how they would, and they mostly conducted themselves the same way. Morris would have us believe that it was very random, that it wasn't, but mostly there were expulsions, mostly there were summary murders, mostly there were atrocities. By the way, we were reminded, atrocities that are still sealed by the Israeli government. And here I'll end with this. Certainly no commander was subsequently charged with or trying for not expelling, or for that matter, for expelling villagers. So if it was not something that the Israelis intended, they didn't try anyone for doing it. And if it was something that they intended, they didn't try anyone for not doing what it was. So I think the strategy is clear. Having no order protected the leadership and even protected the soldiers. And Morris's hunt for a smoking gun, which then allows him to somewhat be triumphant and see, so, well, since there's no smoking gun, then you're all conspiracy theorists. Instead, really just puts him into a position where he's just making, as I said, a distinction without a difference. Layla Parsons, in her essay called The Druze and the Birth of Israel, directly argues against Morris's thesis by using the Druze as a case study. Now, you might be asking, Stephen, who are the Druze? Great question. And although I knew about them vaguely, I don't want to try to pretend like I know a lot. So I'm just going to read you the definition as I found. All right. So the Druze are an ethno-religious group of Arabic speakers from West Asia who practice a monotheistic religion that incorporates elements of Islam, Hinduism, and classic Greek philosophy. They are concentrated in Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, with around 1 million adherents worldwide. The Druze split off from Islam in the 11th century and called themselves Al-Muwahhidun, which means the monotheists or the Unitarians. Their religion emphasizes Abrahamic monotheism, but considers religion as separate from Islam. And what you have to realize is the Druze very early on threw in their lot with the IDF and even served with the IDF against the Palestinians. So even though they had lived beside the Palestinians for many years, centuries, they decided to go over to the side they perceived to be the stronger one, and they fought against the Palestinians. Now, no Druze were expelled. There was one time in which the Druze did not cooperate, but they were not expelled. They simply didn't get, I think, school funding later on when they were incorporated into the new state of Israel. They were somewhat, let's say, punished, but they weren't expelled. And so if Morris's thesis, Parsons is arguing, if Morris's thesis is true, that the Palestinian refugee problem was born of war, not of design, then why is it that no Druze communities were expelled when there were people from every other community that were expelled? The Druze were not. And partially it was because they were play acting with the Israelis. So I'll give you an example of this. Everything went according to plan. When the Muslim quarter was being attacked, this is in Nazareth. This was a very famous attack in Nazareth. Everything went according to plan. While the Muslim quarter was being shelled, the assault force approached the walls. These are the Israelis. They and the Druze so-called defenders fired harmlessly over each other's heads. The attackers quickly passed through Druze lines, entering the village and capturing the Muslim quarter from the rear. Within a short time, the whole town was in our hands. The faked battle of Shafa Amir and the consequent capture of Nazareth gave momentum to the Druze-Jewish alliance, demonstrating such success that its potential benefits came to be discussed not only by IDF officers on the ground, but also by officials in the Israeli Foreign Ministry. And so, again, Parsons says, There are many other examples of cooperation between the Israeli military and the Druze, but the above should suffice to illustrate the degrees of the collusion. With regard to Benny Morris's randomness hypothesis, the point is that the existence of this special relationship between Druze and Jews makes it difficult to believe that the fact that no Druze were expelled from their towns or villages can be put down to chance. And another really great line from the essay. If you have a policy not to do something, it implies that you also have a position on what you are doing. So what she's saying, Morris has convinced me that there was no generally articulated, overarching policy of expulsion in the war, at least in the sense in which Morris understands the term policy. But if you, as she says, if you have a policy not to do something, it implies that you also have a position on what you are doing. And it's even better if you don't write it down, because that protects you. That protects you, protects your soldiers, protects your leadership, and it makes sure that you can't get into trouble in the future. So in this next essay, Israel and the Arab Coalition in 1948 by Avi Shlaim, whose other books I'm going to be reviewing later this year. I'm really excited to talk about those with you for any number of reasons, but for right now, we're only going to talk about a short essay of his. He in his essay, attacks the thesis that you'll often hear, and I've had repeated to me numerous times by Israelis, which is 6 Arab armies invaded us, they were going to throw us into the sea, and we were just little Israel, and it was a miracle that we were saved. And this is not at all what is true. The traditional Zionist version of the Arab-Israeli conflict places the responsibility on the Arab side. Israel is portrayed as the innocent victim of unremitting Arab hostility and Arab aggression. The biblical image of David and Goliath is frequently evoked in this narrative. Little Israel is portrayed as fighting with its back to the wall against a huge, well-armed, and overbearing Arab adversary. Israel's victory in this war is treated as verging on the miraculous, and as resulting from the determination and heroism of the Jewish fighters rather than from disunity and disarray on the Arab side. This heroic version of the War of Independence has proved so enduring and resistant to revision precisely because it corresponds to the collective memory of the generation of 1948. It is also the version of history that Israeli children are taught at school. Consequently, few ideas are as deeply ingrained in the mind of the Israeli public as that summed up by the Hebrew phrase, me'atim mul rabim, or the few against the many. The argument advanced in this chapter, in a nutshell, is that the Arab coalition facing Israel in 1947 to 49 was far from monolithic, that within this coalition there was no agreement on war aims, that the inability of the Arabs to coordinate their diplomatic and military moves was partly responsible for their defeat, that throughout the conflict Israel had the military edge over its Arab adversaries, and finally, and most importantly, that Israel's leaders were aware of the divisions inside the Arab coalition and that they exploited these divisions to the full in waging the war and in extending the borders of their state. So nobody's ever going to convince me that the Israelis don't know how to fight a war. They are brilliant war fighters, and they have been going back to biblical times. But the narrative that they were the poor little outnumbered people, it just shows you how deep the myth goes. It's actually the opposite. They were always in the ascendancy, and the Arabs would have needed a lot to go their way in order to even be an equal, in order to even give themselves a fighting chance against the Israelis in the field. As such, they never got their act together, and so they were not equals. And so the Israelis very easily rolled over their enemies. Here's more numbers. In mid-May 1948, the total, and remember the British are pulling out in mid-May of 1948, the total number of Arab troops, both regular and irregular, operating in the Palestine theater was under 25,000, whereas the Israel Defense Force fielded over 35,000. By mid-July, the IDF mobilized 65,000 men under arms, and by December, its numbers had reached a peak of 96,441. The Arab states also reinforced their armies, but they could not match this rate of increase. Thus, at each stage of the war, the IDF outnumbered all the Arab forces arrayed against it, and after the first round of fighting, it outgunned them too. The final outcome of the war was therefore not a miracle, but a faithful reflection of the underlying military balance in the Palestine theater. In this war, as in most wars, the stronger side prevailed. Big surprise. A typical account of the War of Independence by a prominent Israeli diplomat goes as follows. 5 Arab armies and contingents from 2 more, equipped with modern tanks, artillery, and warplanes, invaded Israel from north, east, and south. Total war was forced on the Yishuv under the most difficult conditions. What's the truth? All the states involved, and so we're talking about Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, with contingents from Saudi Arabia and Yemen. All these states only sent an expeditionary force to Palestine, not their entire army, keeping the bulk of their army at home. The expeditionary forces were hampered by long lines of communication, the absence of reliable intelligence by their enemy, poor leadership, poor coordination, very poor planning. And ultimately, there was no unified command and control. It's very nice to have 5, 6, 7 different armies, but if you don't have a single commander coordinating what they're doing, it's actually worse to have that many armies. And so the Israelis would have played up as this was a giant horde coming on them coordinated, but it was 5 disorganized armies that were not coordinated, poorly supplied. And during the first truce, the Israelis, as they always do, ignored the international arms embargo and resupplied using illegal weapons from behind the Iron Curtain, I think from the Czechs. And the British observed the arms embargo and did not resupply the Arabs. The Arab coalition was beset by profound internal political differences. The Arab League, since its foundation in 1945, was the highest forum for the making of pan-Arab policy on Palestine. But the Arab League was divided between a Hashemite bloc consisting of Transjordan and Iraq, and an anti-Hashemite bloc consisting of led by Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Dynastic rivalries played a major part in shaping Arab approaches to Palestine. So obviously Abdullah, King Abdullah of Jordan, at the time Transjordan, had the idea of being the father of the Palestinians, and his idea was not to allow another Palestinian state, ideally for their part led by the Grand Mufti, the all-Palestinian government, which would eventually arise in Gaza. He didn't want that. He wanted to create another state and an extension of his state, and he had already had talks with the Israelis for years about this, and this only comes out much later. From the Zionist point of view, Abdullah was an immensely valuable ally. First and foremost, he was the only Arab ruler who was prepared to accept the partition of Palestine and to live in peace with the Jewish state after the conflict had been settled. Second, his small army, the Arab Legion, was the best trained and most professional of the armies of the Arab states. Third, Abdullah and his aides and agents were a source of information about the other Arab countries involved in the Palestine problem. Last but not least, through Abdullah, the Zionists could generate mistrust, foment rivalry, and leak poison to weaken the coalition of their Arab adversaries. And of course, the other members of the Arab League, these other nations, they knew that Abdullah was colluding, and for other reasons, and this gets into deeper stuff that we could talk about probably in another book review, or probably in part 2 of this book review, is the tensions between the Hashemite and the non-Hashemite side. So Abdullah has an idea of forming a greater Syria, which obviously, if you're the nation of Syria, you don't really want that to happen. The leader of Iraq, the regent, is also a Hashemite. And keep in mind, the Hashemites were expelled from the area around Mecca, where they had been the sharifs for centuries, guarding the holy sites of Islam. Well, the Saudis, for their part, they didn't want the Hashemites to rise in power because maybe they would try to invade and take back the Hijaz. Now, all of these tensions are going on, and in the meantime, the Palestinians are trying to raise their hand and say, hey, would you like to help us out? And instead, what happens is all of these petty political rivalries, or you could say grand political power games, are being played, and the Palestinians are merely a pawn, merely an episode in these larger issues. And I think this book will help you start to get a grasp of that, which I can say certainly I did not have prior to reading these essays. This survey of Israel's strategy and tactics in dealing with the Arab coalition in 1948 is not intended to belittle Israel's victory, but to place it in its proper political and military context. And when one probes the politics of the war and not merely the military operations, the picture that emerges is not the familiar one of Israel standing alone against the combined might of the entire Arab world, but rather one of a remarkable convergence between the interests of Israel and those of Transjordan against the other members of the Arab coalition, and especially against the Palestinians. All right. The last essay in this part of the review, so part one, is from Eugene Rogan, and I'll just add on to what was being said. I don't think there's too much more that I want to add on here. Common interest guided the Jewish Agency and Transjordan in their agreement. Partition held the prospect of statehood for the Yishuv, territorial expansion for Transjordan, and the abortion of a Palestinian Arab state that would inevitably be headed by their common enemy, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini. Right, so both Golda Meir and King Abdullah did not want another state to happen in Palestine. For Meir's part, she thought, well, we know Abdullah, and if you want to take care of the Arabs, we don't really want the Palestinians in our state anyway. So the devil we know is better than the devil we don't know. We don't know. Well, we do know that al-Husseini will be hostile to us, so we'd rather there not be a Palestinian state. So from the very beginning, we have Arabs, the Jordanians, and when I say the Jordanians, I'm saying King Abdullah. I don't think his population would have supported this. King Abdullah conspires against the Palestinians together with the Israelis. And if this doesn't happen, this is yet another way that Israel might not have prevailed. But Israel basically had every single thing go their way, and that was part of why they were able to prevail. Not only because they were militarily superior, but because they were diplomatically superior. They were cunning. Everything that you need to do in war, the Israelis did it, and that's why they won that. But it was also, you could say, very bad luck for the Palestinians in terms of who their so-called allies were. They didn't really have any, unfortunately, and many good men, volunteers who went to the front line to die for the Palestinians, they were betrayed by their leadership. I think that's obvious. So I'm going to continue right after this video with part two for the war for Palestine. And I'm going to look at briefly the other states that I alluded to in this part of the essay by going and looking at the political situation in each of those countries. Again, very briefly, because that's all we can do in a book review. So as always, if you enjoyed this, if you know someone who could benefit from this, please share it with them, hit like, hit subscribe, consider buying the book. That's one way you can support the channel. You can also join my Patreon or become a member on YouTube. That's another way you can support this channel. Make sure that I continue to do these reviews. You'll get early releases to videos like this. Your contributions there, as also if you send a super thanks, will go towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund in 2024. They're one of the beneficiaries I've chosen to send in a portion of my income this year to help the children in Palestine who would not otherwise have medical attention. And if you'd like to just look through my Amazon wish list and send a book my way, I might be able to review it. Although, as I say, 2024 is pretty committed already, but maybe I might be able to slip it in. We'll see. As always, enjoy your reading.